Oh no, don't give me that steady stare, you're not going to intimidate me. I asked you a question and you still haven't answered it. You think silence is going to get you through this gate? That's not how security works, not with me. I've seen your type try this before. And I'm stopping it right now. Officer Brent Wallace, a 38-year-old man known for his rigid posture and clipped tone, stood firm in front of the boarding gate, his voice echoing across the quiet terminal. His finger pointed sharply toward the woman in the mustard-yellow blazer who hadn't flinched once since he started his tirade. Passengers nearby slowed their steps. Some turned their heads. Others pretended not to notice, eyes darting elsewhere but ears locked on the scene unfolding. Dr. Felicia Hart, a composed and striking woman in her mid-40s, stood with her boarding pass in one hand and calm resolve in the other. She had the presence of someone used to pressure, the kind of quiet confidence that made arrogance look small. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't frown. She just breathed, steady and poised as the officer's voice rose with each word. "I need you to step aside for an additional search," Brent demanded. "You've been acting nervous since you got to the gate." "I haven't," Felicia replied softly. "Oh, you have. You keep looking around like you're hiding something." His voice hardened. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, ma'am." Her eyes didn't waver. Is calmness now considered suspicious? A few gasps whispered through the air. Brent's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, voice dripping with authority. "Ma'am, I don't need attitude. I need compliance." Felicia exhaled. "You have neither my attitude nor my resistance. You have my patience. For now." The words were quiet, measured, but they landed like a stone in still water. Something about her tone, its precision, its quiet certainty, made a few onlookers lift their brows. But Brent didn't notice. His world was tunnel vision, his authority like a badge of pride he could not set down. Behind Felicia, a young woman in line, Lily Anders, 29, an observant traveler with restless eyes, shifted her weight, feeling the unease crawl through the terminal. She looked from Brent's pointed finger to Felicia's still face, and then around at the others who stood in stiff silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Lily's chest tightened. Something about this didn't feel like standard protocol. It felt like humiliation dressed as procedure. Brent's hand hovered near his belt. Bag on the table. Now. Felicia slowly placed her designer handbag on the inspection counter. Her movements were graceful, deliberate. "I hope your confidence in this moment matches your accuracy," she said quietly. He smirked. "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." She said nothing. Only watched. He unzipped the bag roughly, pulling out papers, a sleek tablet, a leather-bound notebook. "What's this?" he barked. "My work," she replied. "What kind of work?" "The kind that keeps people like you employed," she said, still without anger. A ripple of discomfort moved through the small crowd forming near the gate. Brent froze for half a second, uncertain if he heard arrogance or truth. He decided it was arrogance. "You want to be careful with that tone, ma'am?" "I am careful," she said. "You, however, are not." Her calm made him furious. "You think you can talk to me like that because you're dressed up in a fancy suit? You think that means something here?" Felicia didn't look at him. "Not here. Not to you. But to the people who matter, it will." The gate area thickened with tension. Lily's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, unsure if she should record. People were whispering now, quiet waves of curiosity and judgment. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical. But most stayed still, silent witnesses to a scene too familiar and too uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to call for backup," Brent declared, radio in hand. "For what?" she asked evenly. "For non-compliance." Felicia tilted her head slightly. "You should listen to yourself. You've mistaken dignity for defiance." He didn't respond. His authority felt fragile now, as if one wrong word from her might shatter the illusion of control he carried. But he couldn't stop. His training, his biases, his need to dominate the moment, all of it kept pushing him forward. Lily's voice came out shaky but audible. She didn't do anything wrong. She just... Brent spun toward her. "Stay out of this, ma'am." The young woman flinched back. Felicia looked at Lily briefly, a faint nod of appreciation in her eyes. It was enough to keep Lily rooted there even in fear. What would you do in this moment? The thought seemed to echo through the air, unspoken but shared among those watching. Would you stay silent, or would you speak up when you saw something unjust? If you believe that silence is never the answer to injustice, remember to hit subscribe and share stories that matter. Brent turned back to Felicia. You're not boarding this plane until I say so. Understood. She smiled faintly. You may hold my boarding pass, officer, but you don't hold my future. The words landed with quiet power. He blinked, confused by her certainty, his irritation growing under the weight of her calm. A minute later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the terminal. A tall man in a charcoal suit approached. Charles Mackay, a confident, composed 50-year-old whose presence carried authority without effort. His ID badge flashed the airline's logo. He walked straight to Felicia, his face lighting up with recognition. Dr. Hart. I'm so sorry for the delay, he said warmly, extending his hand. We've been expecting you. Brent froze mid-sentence. Felicia smiled and shook Charles's hand. It's all right. I was just receiving an unexpected demonstration in airport security. Charles frowned, turning sharply toward Brent. Demonstration? Officer Wallace, what is this? Brent's lips parted, words stumbling. Just following standard procedures, sir. She seemed. Seemed what? Charles interrupted, his voice now like steel. Dr. Hart owns the supply company that provides this airline with our aircraft components. The same components you trust every time you clear a plane for boarding. The silence that followed was unbearable. Whispers rippled again, but now they carried something else, shock. Brent's face drained of color. I didn't know. Felicia's eyes softened, but her tone stayed firm. You didn't ask. Lily exhaled shakily, relief mixed with awe. She just witnessed a reversal of power so swift it felt cinematic, but the reality of it stung deeper. Charles turned back to Felicia. Please, Dr. Hart, allow me to escort you personally to the lounge before your flight. Felicia nodded. Thank you. And Officer Wallace. She turned to him, eyes steady. Next time you look at someone, I hope you see a person before you see a threat. Her voice carried through the terminal like truth cutting through noise, measured, human, impossible to ignore. As she walked past, Brent stood frozen, every ounce of false authority stripped bare by dignity. Charles followed, and the bystanders watched them disappear toward the private gates, the whispers fading into silence. Felicia didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because real power doesn't need to raise its voice. Comment below if you believe dignity deserves equal respect, no matter who stands at the gate. Hit subscribe if you believe that racism in any form has no place in authority. The terminal quieted as Felicia and Charles walked away, the crowd slowly dispersing. But the silence left behind wasn't peace, it was a heavy kind of reckoning that lingered in the air. Officer Brent Wallace stood still, his hand trembling near his radio, realizing that every word he'd said, every assumption he'd made, was now echoing back against him like judgment. Charles led Felicia toward the executive lounge. I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Hart. We'll be taking immediate action. Felicia gave a faint smile. You don't owe me an apology, Charles. The system does. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet fatigue. It wasn't the first time she'd faced suspicion disguised as procedure. But this time, the humiliation had come in front of a crowd, and not one person had stepped forward until it was almost too late. Charles nodded. Still, it won't go unanswered. Lily Anders lingered by the gate, watching the two figures disappear beyond the frosted glass doors. Her throat tightened with guilt. She had wanted to intervene earlier, to speak louder, to do more, but fear had locked her voice behind her ribs. Now she replayed the moment over and over, the officer's tone, the crowd's stillness, Felicia's unwavering calm. What would you have done? She whispered to herself. Would you have spoken up or just watched like everyone else? It's a question that sits heavy in many hearts. If you believe courage starts with one voice, even when it trembles, then don't scroll past. Share this story and remind someone that silence protects no one. Behind the lounge doors, Felicia removed her blazer and sat quietly. The world outside still spun in its rush of departures and arrivals, but inside, everything slowed. She thought about how easily dignity can be stripped in public, how fragile the illusion of progress feels when prejudice still walks proudly in uniform. Charles sat across from her, his tone low but firm. The moment I got the call about a disruptive passenger, I knew something was wrong. I've worked with you for years, Felicia. You've never been anything but composed. Felicia folded her hands. Composure doesn't protect me from perception, Charles. To some, calmness itself looks like defiance. He sighed, leaning forward. We'll make sure this never happens again. It will, she said softly. To someone else. Tomorrow. Next week. At another gate, another checkpoint. That's the problem, we keep fixing incidents instead of the attitude behind them. Her words hung there, a truth too large to ignore. Charles nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time we stop reacting and start restructuring. Policy, training, accountability, all of it. Felicia met his eyes. Start with empathy. That's where real change begins. Outside, Officer Brent still stood at the gate, his chest tight with something unfamiliar, shame. He'd been trained to spot signs of nervousness, to question the unusual. But no one had ever taught him to question himself. No manual warned that bias could wear a badge as easily as a suspect could wear a smile. His supervisor approached, clipboard in hand. Wallace, what happened here? He swallowed hard. Just a misunderstanding. Dr. Felicia Hart filed an incident report, the supervisor said. You detained the owner of one of our key supplier companies. Corporate's not pleased. Brent's throat tightened. I was just doing my job. Your job doesn't include profiling, came the stern reply. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending review. As the words hit him, Brent's shoulders sagged. Around him, the terminal carried on like nothing had happened. Planes departing, people laughing, announcements echoing overhead. But for the first time in years he felt small in a place built on authority. Lily watched from a distance. She saw the officer being led away, his face pale, his steps slow. Justice had arrived, but it didn't erase the pain that came before it. It only exposed it. Later that evening, Lily sat in the waiting area near her next connection, typing on her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she drafted a post. Today I saw a woman accused for no reason but the color of her skin. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight. She simply stood in truth and truth won. But it shouldn't have to take power to earn respect. She paused before pressing post. Then she added, if you believe equality shouldn't depend on recognition or wealth, share this. Because dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. She hit publish. Meanwhile, in the executive lounge, Felicia's phone buzzed. She glanced down and saw dozens of notifications. Her name trending, her story spreading, strangers expressing outrage and support. She read a few, then set the phone aside. Fame or sympathy didn't move her. Change did. Charles returned with 2 cups of coffee. You're going viral, he said with a half smile. Felicia nodded. Let it remind people that civility isn't silence. It's strength. He looked at her thoughtfully. Do you ever get tired of being the example? All the time, she admitted. But if silence allows injustice to breathe, I'll speak. Even quietly. Outside the lounge, reporters had already arrived, cameras waiting for a glimpse. Brent's suspension had leaked, and the airport's PR team scrambled to control the story. But truth spreads faster than control. A reporter called out as Felicia stepped into the hall. Dr. Hart, any comment on the incident? She paused. Only this. Respect should not depend on recognition. The moment we require titles to deserve dignity, we've already lost our humanity. The flashbulbs blinked. The world listened. Lily watched the coverage on her phone from her seat at the terminal window, tears in her eyes. She whispered softly, that's what strength looks like. Then she smiled faintly, realizing something important. Maybe courage isn't always loud. Maybe it's calm, patient, and unwilling to be diminished. Felicia boarded her flight at last. As she settled into her seat, the hum of the engines filled the air. A new day waited beyond the clouds, and she carried herself with the same grace that had unsettled her accuser. Sometimes, the quietest presence in the room is the most powerful truth. If you've ever witnessed injustice and wished you'd done more, remember, change begins the moment we refuse to stay silent. Hit subscribe if you believe in a world where dignity travels without permission. The plane leveled off above the clouds, the golden light of early evening spilling through the windows. Felicia leaned back, eyes closed, the quiet hum of the cabin around her. The storm of what had happened hours ago still flickered at the edges of her mind, but she refused to let it define her. Not tonight. Not again. Charles sat across the aisle, scrolling through his phone. Corporate just released a statement, he said softly. They're calling for a full investigation. Felicia didn't open her eyes. An investigation into what? A moment of truth. He sighed. They're trying to make it right. Right? She opened her eyes now, steady and calm. It's not about me, Charles. It's about the thousands of people who don't have a title to protect them when they're profiled in silence. He nodded. You're right. But you turned that silence into something powerful. Felicia looked out the window at the fading light. Power shouldn't be required to demand respect. That's what hurts most. She thought back to the gate, the officer's eyes, the crowd's stillness, the sharp sting of being accused without reason. It wasn't the first time she'd been made small by someone who saw only her skin before her story. But it was the first time she'd felt the full weight of others' silence pressing down on her like approval. Lily's face came back to her, wide-eyed, trembling, trying to speak up. That small act had meant more than she could show in the moment. It was courage, imperfect but real. The kind the world needed more of. Down in the terminal, Lily was still waiting for her next flight, reading the comments flooding her post. Thousands of likes. Thousands of people saying they were sorry. But apology without change felt hollow. She typed again, her hands shaking with purpose. Don't just say you're sorry. Be different. When you see wrong, speak. When you see bias, confront it. When someone's dignity is questioned, protect it. Then she locked her phone, feeling the pulse of something new, resolve. In the air, Felicia opened her laptop. A blank document glowed back at her, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She began typing notes for a new initiative, the Hart Foundation for Equity in Aviation. She'd been planning it quietly for years, but now it felt urgent, alive. It wouldn't just address diversity on paper. It would demand accountability where it mattered most. In training, in hiring, in leadership. Charles leaned over. Starting already? Always, she replied. You fix systems by rebuilding them, not apologizing for them. He smiled faintly. You really don't stop. I can't afford to, she said. People think power shields you from bias. It doesn't. It just gives you a bigger stage to fight it. Back at the airport, Officer Brent sat in a small, gray conference room, hands clasped tight, a disciplinary officer across from him. He couldn't meet her eyes. For the first time, the uniform that once made him feel untouchable now felt heavy, suffocating. The footage from the security cameras had been reviewed. There was no threat. Just prejudice. The officer across the table said quietly, You've been placed on administrative leave. The company will decide next steps after the inquiry. Brent nodded numbly. I didn't mean. That's the problem, she interrupted gently. You didn't think you were doing anything wrong. That's where bias hides best. He looked down, words failing him. Somewhere deep inside, shame and reflection began to tangle. Maybe it was too late to undo the damage, but it wasn't too late to change. Felicia's flight touched down just as the city lights began to glow below. She gathered her things and walked down the private jetway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her assistant waited near the exit, phone in hand, eyes wide. Dr. Hart, the media wants a statement. CNN, BBC, everyone's calling. Felicia smiled faintly. Then they'll get one. But not about humiliation, about humanity. Hours later, under soft lights in her downtown office, cameras were set up. She sat before them, her tone calm, her presence undeniable. When a system allows bias to wear authority, she began, it's not the system that's broken, it's the conscience behind it. I don't want apologies. I want awareness. I don't want pity. I want partnership and change. I want people to remember that every story like mine has 1,000 untold names behind it. Her words rolled across the airwaves, finding hearts that had long gone unheard. Lily watched the live stream from her apartment. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. This wasn't just a speech. It was a mirror held up to everyone who had ever stood in silence when someone was treated unfairly. "What would you do in that moment?" she whispered to herself again. "Would you still look away? If you believe change begins with accountability, let your actions reflect your words. Like, share, subscribe, not for attention but to spread awareness that power should always protect, not oppress." The next morning, the story dominated headlines. The airport released an official apology. Brent's suspension turned into termination, and new training programs were announced overnight. But the true victory wasn't punishment, it was transformation. Felicia sat by her office window, sipping coffee as the sunrise touched the skyline. She thought of the gate, of the faces that had watched, and of one woman who had dared to speak even briefly. Courage, she realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply whispered, "This isn't right." Her phone buzzed, a message from Lily. It read, "Thank you for showing me what grace under fire looks like. I'll never stay silent again." Felicia smiled, replying, "That's how change begins, with one voice then another." Outside, the city came alive. People hurried to flights, to meetings, to ordinary moments where extraordinary choices waited quietly. And somewhere, perhaps in another terminal, another officer stood ready to question someone, but this time maybe he'd think twice. If this story moved you, remember, justice begins in the smallest decisions. Stand up, speak out, and never underestimate the strength of calm conviction. The morning after the story broke, the world seemed to tilt a little differently. The airport that once felt like a place of routine now buzzed with uneasy awareness. Security teams whispered in hallways. Managers reviewed protocols. Reporters gathered near the main entrance, waiting for updates. What had begun as one man's prejudice was now an entire company's reckoning. Felicia, however, moved through the day with quiet steadiness. She didn't chase interviews or court attention. She simply went to work, her own headquarters, a glass-paneled building overlooking the runway. From her window she could see the planes rise and fall like reminders of freedom and control, how quickly one could turn into the other. Charles entered her office mid-morning carrying a folder. "They've officially terminated Brent Wallace," he said. "And they're implementing new cultural sensitivity programs immediately. Mandatory for all staff." Felicia nodded, eyes on the sky. "Training is good," she said softly, "but it's not transformation. You can train a person to follow a rule. You can't train them to unlearn hate." Charles took a seat. "Then what would you do?" "I'd start with truth," she replied. "The truth about how it feels to be doubted for simply existing. The truth about being told you don't belong in places you built the doors for." Her gaze shifted to the framed photo on her desk, a younger version of herself beside a small aircraft. "You change a system by changing what it values." Across town, Lily scrolled through the news coverage. Her post had reached nearly 1 million shares overnight. Messages poured in from strangers thanking her for speaking up. But she knew she hadn't done enough. She hadn't stopped the officer in the moment. That regret still pressed on her heart like a weight. She wanted to do more than just post words, she wanted to act. She typed another message, "I want to learn. I want to help. Dr. Felicia Hart, if you see this, I'd like to volunteer for your foundation." Minutes later, her phone buzzed. A reply from Felicia's assistant, inviting her to meet in person. Lily froze for a second, then smiled, a mix of nerves and resolve filling her chest. Sometimes fate moves quietly, waiting for courage to catch up. Back at the airport, Brent sat alone in his small apartment. His uniform hung over a chair, lifeless. For years he had believed discipline made him fair, that following the book protected him from bias. But the truth was simpler and harder. The book hadn't protected him from himself. The face of Dr. Hart haunted him, not out of guilt alone, but because she had looked at him without hate. That calm gaze had exposed something in him he'd spent a lifetime denying. He realized he didn't need redemption from her. He needed it from his own conscience. He opened his laptop, typed racial bias in law enforcement training, and began to read. For the first time in years, he was learning without trying to justify. A week later, the Hart Foundation for Equity in Aviation launched publicly. Cameras flashed as Felicia stood on stage, her mustard blazer catching the light. The audience filled with executives, journalists, and young professionals eager to listen. Lily sat in the second row, heart pounding. Felicia began, her voice clear and calm. Bias is not always a slur shouted in anger. Sometimes it's a question asked with suspicion. Sometimes it's a silence that lets injustice stand. And sometimes, it's a rule enforced unevenly against those who have done nothing wrong. The room grew still. Every word carried weight. "I don't stand here as a victim," she continued. "I stand as a woman who built something despite the doubt. I own one of the largest aviation supply firms in the country, but that did not protect me from being treated like a threat. So I ask, what happens to those without power, without recognition, without a voice?" She paused, letting the question settle over the crowd. That's why this foundation exists. To make sure that respect isn't granted by status, but by simple human decency. Lily wiped a tear, feeling both seen and challenged. For the first time, she understood that allyship wasn't about pity, it was about partnership. About using privilege to protect others, not excuse oneself. Felicia continued, "If you believe in equal skies, if you believe travel should never remind someone of their place but of their possibility, then stand with us. Share this story. Share your own. Change begins when empathy becomes action." Her closing words earned a standing ovation. Cameras flashed. But Felicia's eyes found Lily's in the crowd. She gave a small nod, the kind that said you mattered in this story too. After the event, Lily approached her, hands trembling slightly. "Dr. Hart," she said, "I don't know if you remember me from the airport?" Felicia smiled. "Of course I do. You spoke when others didn't." "I wish I had spoken sooner," Lily said softly. Felicia touched her arm. "You spoke when it counted. That's what courage looks like." The moment hung between them, two women, different in color and background, united by conscience. In that instant, the power dynamic that had defined their world began to feel a little more balanced. Across the room, Charles watched the exchange, pride flickering in his eyes. "You really are unstoppable," he said later as they walked to the car. Felicia laughed lightly. "No. Just persistent. Justice doesn't move unless someone pushes." "Then here's to the push," he said. Felicia smiled. "And to everyone brave enough to keep pushing." Outside, the city lights shimmered like a promise. Imperfect, incomplete, but still bright. The air felt lighter, as if the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly right before your eyes? Would you stay silent or step forward even when it's uncomfortable? If your answer is action, real, honest, human action, then don't just agree in silence. Follow, share, subscribe, and remind others that real equality doesn't wait for applause, it waits for courage. Days passed, but the echoes of that airport scene still pulsed through the world. What happened to Dr. Felicia Hart had become more than just a headline, it had become a mirror. Airports in other cities began revising their own practices. Corporations quoted her speech in diversity meetings. Schools used her video as a case study in ethics. Change was rippling outward, slow but undeniable. Felicia, however, had little time to bask in public praise. She was already back to work, reshaping the structure of her own company and advising the airline on internal reform. Her strength was quiet but constant, a presence that turned discomfort into dialogue. In her boardroom, sunlight poured across the polished table where several executives sat. Charts, reports, and media briefs lay scattered. Charles stood at the head of the table, gesturing to a screen displaying the foundation's progress. "Over 300 employees have enrolled in the Empathy and Awareness program," he said. "Flight attendants, gate staff, even some airport police officers." Felicia nodded. "Good. But enrollment isn't impact. Let's measure how people behave 6 months from now, not how they perform under a spotlight. Charles smiled. Still the perfectionist. Still the realist, she countered, closing a folder. I've seen policies rewritten with perfect language and still fail in practice. This can't be another moment that fades after the hashtags stop. Outside, a soft knock came at the door. Lily stepped in holding a notepad. She looked more confident now, shoulders straight, eyes bright with purpose. Felicia's mentorship had already begun shaping her. I've finished drafting the first campaign for the foundation, Lily said, handing Felicia the papers. It's called See the Person, Not the Profile. Felicia scanned the proposal and smiled. That's powerful. What inspired it? Lily hesitated, then spoke softly. Because that day I saw how easy it is to freeze when someone is being humiliated. I didn't want to be another quiet bystander ever again. I want others to know that empathy isn't passive, it's active. Felicia nodded approvingly. You've learned the most important lesson. Justice doesn't live in apology. It lives in responsibility. Across town, Brent Wallace sat at a community center table, staring at the sign taped to the wall. Bias Awareness Workshop. He was there voluntarily. A few heads turned when he walked in. Some recognized him from the viral story. Shame flushed his face, but he stayed. The first step toward change, he told himself, was to face the truth without defense. An older black instructor spoke at the front of the room. We can't fix what we won't admit. Bias isn't always hatred, it's habit. It's the stories you believe before asking questions. Brent listened. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. For the first time he simply heard. Back at the Foundation's office, the day grew long. Felicia and Lily stayed late, finalizing outreach strategies. They spoke about airports, education, and even police training partnerships. But underneath all the logistics, a deeper truth connected them. Both had changed because of that one moment at the gate. Do you ever think about him? Lily asked quietly. Officer Wallace? Felicia replied. Sometimes. Not with anger but with hope. People can learn if they're willing. Lily nodded. You really believe that? I have to, Felicia said. If I stop believing people can change, then I've already lost faith in the justice I'm fighting for. Outside the large windows, the city glowed under a night sky that seemed calmer than before. The world hadn't transformed completely, but something in it had shifted, small, fragile, but real. Later that week, Felicia received a handwritten letter at her office. The return address made her pause before opening it. It was from Brent Wallace. She unfolded the page carefully. Dr. Hart. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to thank you. You showed me something I should have seen long ago. I've started working with a local youth program to teach about fairness and perception. I can't undo what I did, but I can choose what kind of man I become after it. You were right, real power doesn't raise its voice. It listens. Respectfully, Brent Wallace. Felicia read it twice. Then she placed it inside a drawer with a quiet sigh. Redemption, she thought, wasn't about erasing the past, it was about rewriting the next page. That evening, she and Charles attended a formal event honoring diversity leaders in aviation. The room glittered with industry elites, but Felicia carried herself as she always had, graceful, grounded, unaffected by status. When her name was called to receive the Humanity in Leadership Award, she stepped up to the microphone. The applause dimmed as she began to speak. I accept this not as recognition of success, but as a reminder of responsibility, she said. Because every title we earn means nothing if we forget the dignity of those we pass by. I want every person in uniform, every traveler, every worker, to know that fairness isn't an ideal, it's a daily choice. Her eyes swept across the audience. We can't rewrite history overnight. But we can change how we write the present. One decision, one conversation, one moment at a time. She paused, her tone deepening. To those who've ever been judged before being known, I see you. To those brave enough to learn, I honor you. And to those who stood in silence but now choose to speak, welcome to the side of progress. The crowd rose in applause, the sound carrying a rare kind of sincerity. Somewhere among the audience, Lily clapped through tears, knowing she had become part of that side of progress. When Felicia stepped off stage, she smiled faintly at the thought that perhaps, somewhere far away, a security officer might be watching this speech on his television. Silent, reflective, changed. As the night came to an end, Felicia stood near the balcony, city lights twinkling below. "You know," she said to Charles beside her, "every time I think about that day, I realize something important." "What's that?" he asked. "That humiliation was a test," she said. "But not just for me, for everyone who witnessed it. Some failed, some learned, some changed. That's the power of moments like that, they reveal character." Charles nodded. "And build it too." Felicia smiled. "Exactly." She looked out at the endless glow of the skyline and whispered, almost to herself, "We rise when we refuse to look away. If you believe in standing up when others shrink back, share this story. Not for likes, not for attention, but to remind the world that silence is the soil where injustice grows. Hit subscribe if you believe equality should never be conditional, and dignity never negotiable." The months rolled forward, and the story that once shook an airport now began to shape an industry. Change rarely moved fast, but this time it moved with purpose. Felicia had turned her experience into momentum, a blueprint that others began to follow. Airports from New York to Los Angeles reached out to partner with her foundation. Airlines adopted new conduct policies. Awareness was no longer a checkbox, it was a requirement. Yet, in the middle of the progress, Felicia never forgot the human cost that had started it all. One moment of bias. One public humiliation. One choice to stay calm when the world expected her to break. One morning she arrived early at her office. The city was still quiet, the streets half asleep. She sat by the window with her coffee, scrolling through messages from young women who had written to her. Asterisk, "You gave me the courage to stay in this field." Asterisk, "I used to think silence was safer, but not anymore." Asterisk, "I wish I could be as calm as you were that day." She read them slowly, her eyes soft. The calm they admired wasn't born from peace. It was born from exhaustion, from years of having to be composed just to survive. But she smiled anyway because maybe her stillness had finally made noise. Charles entered as usual without knocking. "You're in early." Felicia looked up. "Couldn't sleep. Too many ideas." "That's what happens when you change the world," he teased. She laughed lightly. "Let's not exaggerate. I'm just changing the rules of the gate." Charles raised an eyebrow. "That's where most revolutions start." They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment the weight of leadership felt light. Later that afternoon, Felicia hosted a roundtable with airline CEOs and diversity experts. Among them was an unfamiliar face, a young black security officer, newly promoted to a supervisory role. He spoke nervously at first, then more confidently as he described how the new training programs had changed his perspective. "I used to think following the book was enough," he said. "But now I understand that fairness isn't a checklist, it's a mindset." Felicia nodded, deeply listening. "That's where real reform begins," she said. "Not in the manual, but in the mirror." The room went silent, every executive taking in her words. The transformation was visible. What began as scandal had become structure. What began as pain had turned into policy. Meanwhile, across town, Lily sat in a small classroom at a local community college. She had been invited to speak to students about being an active bystander. She stood before them, nervous, vulnerable, but passionate. "I didn't stop what happened that day," she said. "And that's something I'll always carry. But I learned something powerful. Silence doesn't protect you from guilt, it just delays it. If you see something wrong, speak. Even if your voice shakes, even if it's unpopular, even if no one joins you. Because courage isn't contagious until someone starts it." The students clapped softly. Lily smiled through tears, realizing she had finally found her voice. Back at Felicia's foundation, the day drew to a close. The office buzzed with quiet productivity, assistants answering calls, screens glowing with charts and campaigns. On one wall hung a framed quote Felicia had chosen personally. Asterisk, "Equality begins where fear ends." Asterisk. Charles stopped by her door before leaving. We just confirmed next month's conference in Washington. You'll be speaking before the Transportation Committee. Felicia smiled faintly. Then let's make sure the message travels farther than the speech. As the lights dimmed, she gathered her things and stepped out into the evening air. The city pulsed around her, alive and imperfect. She thought about the journey, from that humiliating confrontation at the gate to this quiet, powerful momentum that now moved in its wake. The contrast felt poetic. Growth often began in the very places meant to break you. At the same time, in a quiet suburb miles away, Brent Wallace finished another session at the youth center. He had spent the afternoon mentoring teenagers about accountability and bias. As he locked up, one of the kids, barely 16, asked, "Mister, how do you fix something after you mess up big?" Brent paused. "You don't fix it overnight," he said. "You just start showing up different every day until your actions speak louder than your past." The boy nodded and Brent smiled for the first time in weeks. Somewhere deep down, he hoped Felicia knew that her grace had planted that seed. The following month, at the Washington conference, Felicia stood before government officials, industry leaders, and journalists. Cameras rolled, flashes clicked, but she remained grounded, unshaken. "When I was detained at that airport," she began, "I was reminded that success does not shield anyone from prejudice. Respect shouldn't depend on the size of your company or the balance of your bank account. It should depend on your humanity." Her voice grew steadier. "We cannot legislate empathy, but we can demand accountability. We cannot force compassion, but we can model it. We can create systems that remind people that authority means service, not superiority." The room listened, silent and transfixed. Felicia paused, then continued, "I forgave the man who detained me, not because what he did was excusable, but because holding anger would have chained me to his ignorance. Forgiveness is not weakness. It's reclamation." Applause rose, not for the drama of the moment, but for the truth within it. After the event, reporters surrounded her, but one young journalist asked quietly, "Dr. Hart, what do you hope people remember from your story?" She smiled. "That dignity doesn't have to shout to be powerful. That justice begins when one person decides that silence is no longer acceptable. And that kindness, when practiced with conviction, can be revolutionary." That evening, as she flew home, the seatbelt sign clicked off and the plane ascended into a clear night sky. She looked out the window, the city lights shrinking below. Somewhere out there, another traveler was being questioned unfairly, another crowd was staying silent, another story was waiting to be told. But maybe, just maybe, the next one would end differently. She closed her eyes, calm and resolute. Because sometimes victory isn't loud. It's the quiet confidence of knowing you've turned your pain into purpose. If you've followed this journey to the end, ask yourself, what would you do the next time you witness injustice? Would you wait for someone else, or would you be the one to speak? Share this story if you believe in courage over comfort. Subscribe if you believe that respect should never have a price tag. And remember, real power isn't measured by who commands, but by who chooses to treat others with humanity.